Amelia Harris never imagined her life would intersect with someone like Evan Knight, the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. Her days had always been a blur of diapers, school runs, and trying to make ends meet. Raising her twins on her own wasn't easy, but it was a life she had learned to navigate with resilience and a quiet sense of pride. She had never once thought of herself as a woman who would seek out legal action, especially not against someone with the wealth and influence that Evan possessed. Yet, here she was sitting at her kitchen table, her hand shaking slightly as she signed the papers for a paternity lawsuit. It had all started a few months ago, after a particularly difficult evening when she had caught a glimpse of her children playing together. The way they smiled, the shape of their eyes, the way their laughter seemed to echo in the air. It struck her in that moment how much they resembled Evan. It wasn't just their features. It was the way they carried themselves, the quiet confidence they exuded. Her mind had raced, replaying the one night they spent together, the night that had changed everything. She had met Evan at a party thrown by a mutual acquaintance, a night that had begun innocently enough. She had no intention of getting involved with anyone, especially not someone so far out of her league, but the attraction between them had been undeniable. The evening had ended with the two of them alone in a quiet corner, talking about everything and nothing at all. Before she knew it, they were entangled in a passionate kiss, her hesitation vanishing in the heat of the moment. It was a fleeting encounter, one that had left her with a bittersweet mix of emotions. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, and she hadn't. There had been no phone calls, no text messages, nothing. She never thought much of it until the twins were born, and the similarities between them and Evan began to surface. For the first time, the thought that one of the most powerful men in the world could be the father of her children became too much to ignore. The resemblance was too striking, too undeniable. She couldn't just keep pretending she didn't see it. But even more than the physical resemblance, there was the emotional toll that came with raising two children on her own. She had worked hard to give them a good life. But as they grew older, the questions started to come. "Where's my daddy?" they would ask. It broke her heart every time. She couldn't answer them with the truth. She didn't know what the truth was. She had tried to make peace with the past, but the nagging doubt gnawed at her. Was Evan really their father? How could she raise her children without knowing the truth? She wasn't sure what drove her to take the next step, whether it was the weight of her own growing uncertainty or the feeling of helplessness that lingered in the back of her mind. What if Evan could help? What if he was willing to be part of their lives? Her thoughts swirled until she could no longer ignore them. That's when she decided to take action. It wasn't about money or revenge. It was about providing her children with the answers they deserved. Amelia's decision to file the lawsuit was met with mixed reactions. Her friends, family, and even some of her colleagues from work had been shocked. She had always been so private, so careful to shield her children from the world. But now, she had made her personal life public in a way she never imagined. The idea of stepping into a courtroom against someone as powerful as Evan felt surreal, but there was no turning back. The thought of him standing there listening to her story terrified her. How could she possibly convince a man like him to acknowledge what had happened all those years ago? Yet Amelia felt a deep sense of resolve. She was a mother, and she would do whatever it took to ensure her children had the answers they deserved. She tried to keep her emotions in check as she thought about the long road ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Evan's legal team would likely dismiss her claim, find ways to discredit her, and minimize her role in the situation. But she wasn't going to back down. For her children, for herself, she had to see this through. The thought of their future, the unknowns that lingered, filled her with both hope and dread. There were so many possibilities, and they all hinged on what would happen next. As she waited for the case to begin, the anticipation gnawed at her. Amelia had no idea how the legal battle would unfold, or what kind of man Evan Knight really was. Would he try to fight the accusation with all the resources at his disposal? Or would he take responsibility? Either way, she couldn't predict what would happen, but she knew one thing for certain. The truth was coming, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now coming back, Evan Knight sat in his penthouse office, staring out over the sprawling city below, a city that had been his empire for over a decade. His eyes were fixed, but his thoughts were a storm of confusion and unease. The lawsuit had come out of nowhere. One moment, his life was running smoothly. Another merger in the works, his company's stock climbing. Then suddenly, Amelia Harris's name was plastered across headlines everywhere. A woman he barely remembered was claiming that he was the father of her twin children. The irony of it was almost laughable. He'd never imagined anything like this happening to him. At first, he tried to dismiss it. After all, the details were sketchy at best, and the very idea that this woman could somehow link him to her children seemed absurd. His lawyers had urged him to ignore it, to let them handle it, and that's what he had done, until the phone call started. Then the rumors, and the media frenzy. The press was relentless. For a man used to controlling every narrative that surrounded him, this was a new kind of chaos. He had dealt with public scrutiny before, but this was different. This wasn't a corporate scandal or a failed business deal. This was personal, and it felt like it was starting to crack open parts of him he didn't want anyone to see. His lawyer had assured him that there was no need to take the case seriously. It was just a woman looking for attention, they said. There was no real evidence, no legitimate reason to believe she could be telling the truth. Still, as the days passed, Evan couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. The images of her and her children, all over the news, had started to seep into his thoughts, creeping in uninvited. Amelia Harris. The name kept echoing in his mind. He tried to recall the night they had shared, the night that, in his memory, was nothing more than a fleeting moment of indulgence during a business trip. A drink, some small talk, a quiet corner in a high-end bar. He had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control, to keep things casual, even with women. But in that one night with Amelia, something had shifted, something he couldn't quite define. Yet, he had never expected her to appear in his life again. Certainly not in this way. The press had painted her as a victim, a single mother seeking accountability. But to Evan, she was just another complication, a complication he had no interest in dealing with. He had worked too hard to build his life and his reputation, and the thought of everything he'd created being thrown into chaos by a lawsuit felt like a punch to the gut. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea began to take root in his mind. Could it be possible? Could he really be the father? The resemblance between the twins and himself was undeniable when he saw the pictures. His thoughts spiraled. He hadn't been careful that night, and truth be told, his memory was a little hazy. He had been distracted, focused on his career, on keeping up appearances. There was a moment of panic, a moment where he imagined the worst-case scenario. What if the children were his? What if this wasn't some baseless claim after all? Evan wasn't a man who liked to be caught off guard. He liked to plan, to strategize, to know what was coming before it even hit the horizon. But with this, he felt like he was fumbling in the dark. As much as he wanted to dismiss Amelia and her lawsuit as nonsense, the reality of it all lingered like a heavy weight on his chest. He could feel his pulse quicken as he thought about the fallout. If this went to trial, it could tear apart everything he had worked for. His company, his carefully constructed public image. Everything could come crashing down in a whirlwind of headlines and courtroom drama. But worse than that, he couldn't ignore the nagging sense of responsibility that kept gnawing at him. If by some impossible twist of fate, Amelia's claim turned out to be true, he would be held accountable. There was no escaping that. Sighing, Evan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. His life had always been about control of his company, his wealth, and his public persona. But now there was this unknown factor, the looming trial, the possibility that everything could change. Evan's lawyer, Henry, called him later that afternoon, reminding him of the media storm that had been stirring outside. "You need to do something, Evan. Let's settle this before it spirals out of control." Henry's voice was steady, but even he knew that this wasn't something that could be easily brushed under the rug. The longer they waited, the more fuel they gave to the flames. As Evan hung up the phone, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The stakes were high now. This wasn't just a lawsuit about parentage. It was about power, control, and what was at risk. Amelia had forced his hand, and whether he was ready for it or not, he would have to face her in court. This wasn't going away. The first day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courthouse was thick with tension. Amelia sat in the back of the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the bustling crowd of lawyers, media personnel, and spectators. She had never imagined that her life would lead to something like this. Her name, her children's names, splashed across every headline, dissected in public. Yet, here she was, ready to face Evan Knight in the place where so many truths were uncovered, truths that neither she nor Evan could ignore any longer. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of it all felt once she stepped into the room. The cold, sterile air of the courthouse, the hum of whispered conversations, and the flash of cameras as people turned their attention toward her. All of it was overwhelming. She took a deep breath and tried to steady her nerves. She had to remain strong, for her children, for herself. They deserved answers, and this was her chance to get them. Amelia had no illusions about what was coming. She had seen how things worked in courtrooms, had watched the media twist and spin stories. She knew the stakes were high, not just for her, but for Evan as well. The moment she stepped into that courtroom, she was no longer just a mother seeking justice. She was up against one of the most powerful men in the world, a man whose empire stretched across the globe. She had to convince not just the judge, but the world that her truth mattered. When the trial began, the tension was palpable. The room fell silent as the judge entered, and both sides were called to present their opening statements. Evan's legal team was polished, sharp, and intimidating. They wasted no time in painting Amelia as a woman who was simply looking for attention and financial compensation, a woman who was trying to manipulate the system. Amelia flinched at their words, but she held her ground. They tried to make it sound like she was some opportunist, using her children to get close to a wealthy, influential man. But she wasn't there for money. She was there for the truth. When it was her lawyer's turn, Amelia felt a wave of relief. Her lawyer, a seasoned attorney named David, was no stranger to high-profile cases, and he understood how to handle the media and the court's pressure. He opened with a calm, measured tone, outlining the facts as he saw them. Amelia had been in a relationship with Evan, and while it had been brief, there was a possibility that he was the father of her children. He spoke about Amelia's dedication to raising her children alone, how she had worked tirelessly to ensure they had a good life, despite the absence of their father. Amelia's heart swelled with a quiet pride as David spoke. He wasn't exaggerating or dramatizing the situation. He was presenting her truth. The truth that Evan might be their father, and that she had the right to know, and her children deserved to know, who they were. She could see the skepticism in Evan's eyes across the room, his posture stiff and distant, his face unreadable. But she wouldn't let that deter her. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to let him dismiss her so easily. The cross-examination started shortly after, and Evan's lawyers were quick to question Amelia's credibility. They attacked her timeline, pointing out inconsistencies in her story, suggesting that she was lying to manipulate the situation. Amelia felt the sting of their words, but she didn't falter. She had been preparing for this, knowing the kind of scrutiny she would face. She answered their questions with calm precision, refusing to let their tactics throw her off balance. When Evan took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. His presence was commanding, as always, exuding an air of control that was almost suffocating. He was dressed impeccably, his jaw tight, and his eyes narrowed, scanning the room with a cold detachment. The questions came fast from the opposing side, aimed at discrediting Amelia's claim, questioning her motives, and casting doubt on her credibility. Evan answered each question with practiced ease, his tone smooth and measured. He never once looked at Amelia, his gaze fixed straight ahead. It was clear that Evan's team had prepared for this moment, their strategy designed to erode her position piece by piece. His answers were calculated, designed to sway the jury and the judge into thinking that Amelia was simply a woman desperate for attention, trying to force a connection where there was none. As he spoke, Amelia could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a battle of wills, and she was beginning to wonder if she could stand her ground long enough to win. But then, as the questioning continued, something unexpected happened. The lawyer on Evan's team asked him about their brief relationship, pressing him on the details of that night. And for the first time, a flicker of discomfort crossed Evan's face. Amelia saw it, a small, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. It was as if he was being caught in a lie, as if the polished mask he had so carefully crafted was beginning to crack. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Amelia to notice. She didn't know if it was intentional or if the pressure was finally getting to him. But in that moment, she felt a strange surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was starting to come out. Maybe there was more to his story than he was letting on. The day ended in a blur of motions and arguments. Amelia felt exhausted, but resolved. She had taken the first step, and though the odds seemed stacked against her, she knew she couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, and she would do whatever it took to uncover it. As she left the courtroom that day, she felt a quiet determination settle in her chest. This was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, but Amelia Harris was ready to see it through to the end. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial continued, but nothing could have prepared Amelia for what came next. She had been steady in the face of cross-examinations and attacks on her credibility, but today was different. Today, the truth was about to unravel in a way she couldn't have predicted. The judge, a quiet, imposing figure, called for a short recess before the next set of evidence was presented. As Amelia sat back in her chair, trying to gather her thoughts, she noticed Evan's tense posture across the room. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his fingers drummed lightly on the table in front of him, an unconscious sign of his nervousness. She hadn't expected that. For the first time in the trial, Evan looked uneasy. It was fleeting, but it was there. Amelia's lawyer, David, pulled her aside during the break. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We've just received the final DNA test results from a separate lab. The paternity test we were expecting, the one that should confirm Evan's involvement, came back inconclusive. But there's something else. We ran additional tests. The truth is, the father is someone else entirely." David looked at her for a moment, letting the weight of the news sink in. "It's a shock. We weren't expecting this." Amelia felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. The breath left her lungs, and she had to grip the back of the chair to steady herself. She'd been fighting for answers, hoping to find closure, to get justice for her children. But this revelation, this twist, was something she couldn't have prepared for. Her mind raced, thoughts spinning wildly. Someone else? Another man had fathered her children, not Evan? I don't understand," Amelia stammered, her voice trembling. "Who? How is that even possible?" David took a deep breath, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I can't give you all the details just yet, but the DNA match is clear. The man we've identified has a direct biological link to your children. We'll have to bring him into this, but it's going to be a lot more complicated than we imagined." Complicated. That was the understatement of the year. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of confusion, anger, and disbelief crashing through her. She had always trusted her gut, always believed in the idea of Evan being the father. She'd built so many assumptions around that. And now, with a single revelation, everything she thought she knew was upended. The trial resumed, and the room seemed quieter now, the air charged with an electricity that hadn't been there before. Amelia's head spun as the new evidence was presented. It was like a fog had settled over everything. The sense of certainty she'd held on fading in the face of an overwhelming truth. The judge asked for clarification on the results, and both teams took a moment to process the implications. Evan's lawyers, who had seemed so confident in their case, were now noticeably shaken. They whispered among themselves, their earlier smugness replaced by a quiet tension. Evan's turn to speak finally came, but there was no composure in his usual calm demeanor now. His jaw was tight, and his eyes darted to Amelia more than once. She could see the panic behind his carefully crafted walls, something slipping through, something real. The man who had once seemed so invincible in his business world was now visibly rattled by a paternity test he never expected to face. I don't understand," Evan said aloud, his voice strained. "How could this be possible? I was told the results would confirm." "You were told what you wanted to hear," David interjected, his voice cold but firm. "The truth is far messier than any of us could have anticipated." Amelia glanced over at Evan, her thoughts in a whirlwind. She had no idea what he was feeling, what he was thinking. All of her anger and hurt seemed to be locked inside of her, not yet ready to pour out. But one thing was clear: she couldn't let him off the hook, not now. The truth wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her children, their lives, their future. As the courtroom waited for more answers, Amelia's mind turned inward. She thought of the nights she had stayed up, wondering if Evan could be the father, if this man, this stranger, could really be the biological father of her children. The idea of him, of the man she had spent so many years believing could be their father, now felt like an illusion. The truth, no matter how complicated, was right in front of her, and she had to face it. The judge ordered a break to allow both sides time to process the new evidence. As the murmur of conversation filled the room, Amelia could feel her hands trembling. She glanced at Evan again. He hadn't looked at her directly, but there was something in his expression, something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't arrogance or control. It was confusion, frustration, and something else, a small crack in his carefully constructed armor. Amelia swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. She didn't have time for this. She had spent so many years feeling isolated, uncertain about the future of her children. The last thing she needed was more questions. Questions about Evan, questions about the other man. The truth had always been elusive, but now it seemed like the ground beneath her was slipping away. She had to keep moving forward, no matter how much it hurt. When the break ended, she stood taller, more resolute than before. This trial had already cost her so much, but now, with the truth finally on the table, she was ready to fight even harder. The children deserved to know who their father truly was, and she would stop at nothing to make sure they got that answer. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Amelia sat in the courtroom, still reeling from the unexpected revelation that the man she had once believed to be the father of her children was not, in fact, the biological father. The courtroom had quieted after the shock of the DNA results, and all eyes were on Evan, whose typically composed demeanor now seemed fragile, his face taut with emotion. He hadn't expected this, and neither had she. But now everything had changed. The judge had called for a brief recess to allow both sides to process the new information. As the room emptied, Amelia sat alone at her table, her hands clasped tightly together, her mind racing. The room felt suffocatingly quiet, a sharp contrast to the buzzing chaos in her head. She had thought the truth was within her grasp, that once Evan was forced to acknowledge his role in the lives of her children, things could move forward. But now, she felt like she was drowning in a new set of questions, each more painful than the last. Who was the father? Why hadn't she known? What did this mean for her children? David, her lawyer, returned to her side after a few moments, his face tense but determined. He had been just as shaken by the revelation as she had, but now was not the time for hesitation. Amelia, he said gently, I know this is a lot to take in, but we have to focus. The truth has come to light, and now we need to decide how we're going to move forward with this. I don't understand, Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. I never imagined this. I thought Evan was the one. Now it feels like everything's been a lie. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I know, but now we need to focus on what's best for you and the kids. We need to track down the real father. We need to understand who this man is, how he fits into your life, and whether he has any intention of being a part of your children's lives. But as David spoke, Amelia's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and betrayal. The man she had trusted, the man she had believed could be the father her children needed, was no longer the answer she had hoped for. And now, there was another man, another unknown entity, waiting in the shadows. Amelia didn't even know where to begin. How had this man come into her life? How had she been so blind to the truth for so long? Her emotions, which she had worked so hard to keep under control, suddenly felt like they were bubbling over. She had lived with the weight of uncertainty for years, wondering, questioning, but never knowing. Now, it was all out in the open, and it was more overwhelming than she could have ever imagined. The recess ended, and as the court began to reconvene, Amelia found herself in a daze. She could feel Evan's eyes on her as he returned to the stand, his expression still unreadable. He had always been a master of control, but now, Amelia saw cracks in that facade. For the first time, he seemed genuinely unsure, vulnerable, as if the man she had spent so many years keeping at arm's length was now someone she could almost feel sorry for. The proceedings picked up where they had left off, but Amelia barely heard the questions being asked. Her mind was focused on one thing: the man who was truly the father of her children. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? How had he been involved in her life, if at all? And more importantly, why had he never come forward before? Evan was being cross-examined again, his lawyers throwing questions at him like daggers. They were trying to piece together what had happened, to explain how this could have occurred, how he could have been caught up in something so unexpected. The lawyer asked him about his memory of that night, about what had transpired. Evan answered, but his words seemed hollow, forced, as if he were trying to grasp something beyond his control. It was clear he had no answers, and it made Amelia's heart ache with a strange sense of empathy she hadn't expected. She had hated him for so long, for the silence, for the years of unanswered questions. But now, in this moment, she found herself questioning him in a different way. Was he really the one to blame for everything? Or was he simply caught in the same web of uncertainty she had been tangled in? The focus then shifted to the real father, though his identity was still kept secret for the moment. David had managed to get some information, but nothing concrete enough to present to the court. The mystery of the man who had fathered her children was looming large, and Amelia was no closer to finding him. She knew she had to press on, to dig deeper, but she wasn't sure how much more she could take. Every time the truth revealed itself, it seemed to be followed by another layer of complication, another twist to the story that she wasn't prepared for. As the day wore on, Evan's lawyers tried to discredit the newly revealed DNA results, suggesting that the testing had been flawed or that the results had been tampered with. But Amelia could feel the shift in the room. The judge's expression had changed, more somber, less willing to entertain the idea that this was all some elaborate mistake. The trial had gone from a battle of accusations to something far more complicated. It was about family now. It was about identity, responsibility, and the pieces of their lives that had been hidden for so long. The session ended with a promise from both sides to present more evidence the following day. Amelia left the courtroom, her head spinning, her heart heavy. She had thought the trial would be about proving Evan's paternity, about getting the acknowledgement she had been seeking for so long. But now, it seemed like the real battle was only just beginning. The truth had taken an unexpected turn, and with it, the very foundation of her understanding of her family had shifted. As she walked out of the courthouse, David at her side, she couldn't help but wonder what the future would look like now. Would the man who was truly the father of her children step forward? Would he take responsibility? And, perhaps most painful of all, what would that mean for her children, who had already been caught in the crossfire of so many secrets and lies? The next steps were unclear, but one thing was certain. Amelia would not stop until she had the answers. Whatever it took, she would face the truth head-on, no matter how much it hurt. Her children deserved that much, and she would not rest until she gave them the answers they needed. The days that followed the bombshell revelation felt like a blur for Amelia. She had hoped that once the truth about the paternity was uncovered, things would begin to settle, that some sense of clarity would emerge. But instead, the trial had taken an unexpected turn, one that Amelia was unprepared for. Now that the true father was still a mystery, everything had become more complicated, and Evan's corporate world was suddenly tied to their personal drama in a way none of them had anticipated. Amelia had no idea how deep Evan's involvement in this case would go. What had started as a fight over the identity of her children's father had now become something far more complex, an unfolding web of corporate maneuvers, shady business deals, and pressure from every angle to make it all go away. Evan's lawyers were no longer just defending him from accusations of fatherhood. They were trying to bury the whole situation, to minimize the damage to his reputation, no matter the cost. As the trial wore on, Evan's company became more of a focal point. Amelia hadn't realized how much his business interests were at stake, but now it was clear. Evan was used to being in control, used to operating in a world where he could smooth over anything that didn't fit the narrative. But this was different. He was being forced into a position where the truth was slipping through his fingers, and he had no control over the outcome. He was becoming desperate to protect not just his reputation, but his empire. It was during one of the many breaks in the proceedings that Amelia overheard a conversation between Evan's lawyer and his corporate advisors. She had been sitting outside the courtroom, trying to clear her head, when the conversation reached her ears. She tried not to listen, but the words pulled her in, a mixture of corporate jargon and hushed, urgent tones. If this goes public, the stock price could drop by 10%. We'll lose millions. We need to bury this. If we settle quickly, we can keep it under wraps, the lawyer was saying. Amelia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. They weren't talking about her or the children. They were talking about Evan's bottom line. They were talking about money, about reputation, and about how to make everything disappear. There was no mention of her children, no concern for the reality that her family was being torn apart. Just cold, calculated business decisions. She felt a surge of anger, but also an undeniable sense of clarity. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't just about the trial. It was about Evan's carefully constructed world and how far he would go to protect it. Evan had built a fortress around himself, and Amelia had walked right into it. But now he wasn't just fighting to hide his involvement. He was fighting to keep his empire from crumbling. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how intertwined their fates had become. The trial wasn't just about paternity. It was about power, about control, and about the influence of a man who had long believed he was above it all. That evening, after a particularly long day in court, Amelia and her lawyer, David, went over the next steps. She could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her, the future of her children's identity hanging by a thread. But the pressure wasn't just from the courtroom anymore. It was from every side, every person involved, each one more concerned with the fallout from Evan's corporate world than with the lives at stake. David was visibly frustrated as he pored over the legal documents. Amelia, we're not just up against Evan here. We're up against a system that protects people like him, people who have the resources to bury the truth if they want to. We need to think strategically. We need to take control of the narrative. Amelia knew he was right. She had been naive to think that everything would be as simple as proving paternity. She had underestimated the lengths Evan would go to, and she had underestimated how far his influence could stretch. As much as she wanted to win this fight for her children, she knew now that it was never going to be easy. But it was a fight she was willing to take on. The truth mattered more than any company, more than any fortune. She couldn't let this be swept under the rug. That night, Amelia sat in her small apartment, her children sleeping soundly in their rooms, and she let herself think. She thought about what it meant to be a mother, to be a woman fighting for answers in a world that so often made her feel powerless. She thought about the choices she had made, the paths she had taken, and how every decision had led her to this moment. The legal battle was wearing her down, but she had something Evan didn't: her unwavering determination. When the trial resumed the next morning, it was clear that the stakes had been raised. Evan's legal team came at her even harder, their tactics more aggressive, their questions designed to shake her confidence. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to break her, to make her second-guess everything she had fought for. They brought in financial experts, PR specialists, and even psychologists to testify about the toll the trial had taken on her. It was as if they were trying to turn the courtroom into a circus, to make her the villain in a story that should have been about the truth. But Amelia was done being intimidated. She had spent too many years in the shadows, too many years of hiding and wondering. This was her moment to step into the light, to show Evan and everyone else that she wasn't going to back down. No matter how much money or power he had, no matter how much influence he wielded, she was fighting for something far more important. And as the trial continued, she could see the cracks in Evan's armor widening. His control was slipping, and for the first time, he was facing a fight he couldn't buy his way out of. The corporate games he had played, the manipulations, the lies, none of it mattered now. The truth was coming out, and no amount of money could change that. The weight of Evan's world was beginning to press down on him in ways he hadn't expected, and as much as he tried to maintain his composure, it was clear he was losing his grip. The battle was far from over, but Amelia was beginning to feel like she was winning. Not because the court had ruled in her favor. Not yet, but because she had taken control of her own story. No matter what happened in that courtroom, no matter the outcome of the trial, she had found her voice. And that, she knew, was more powerful than anything Evan could throw at her. As the trial wore on, the emotional toll began to carve deeper into Amelia than she had ever anticipated. The first few days had been filled with adrenaline, the rush of standing up for her children, the urgency of every word spoken in that courtroom. But now, as the case dragged on, the weight of it all started to settle into her bones. The endless legal jargon, the late nights poring over documents, and the growing realization that this was about far more than just the paternity test. It was about her life, the lives of her children, and the very fabric of her future. Amelia hadn't been prepared for how deeply the case would affect her personally. The constant barrage of questions, the relentless cross-examinations, and the harsh scrutiny from both Evan's team and the media, it was overwhelming. At night, when she would finally retreat to her small apartment, the silence felt suffocating. She would sit in the quiet of her living room, her thoughts racing, wondering if she was doing the right thing. She had always told herself she was fighting for her children, but now she couldn't help but feel like she was losing herself in the process. The guilt gnawed at her. Was she making the right choices? Was the fight worth the toll it was taking on her? It wasn't just the trial itself that was wearing her down. It was the aftermath of everything that had come to light. The shock of discovering that the man she had once believed was the father of her children wasn't. The moment of revelation had been a bitter one. She had spent years imagining Evan as the father, and for a fleeting moment, she had held on to that dream, that perhaps he would step up, take responsibility, and be part of their lives. But now, the truth was more complex than she had ever imagined. The other man, the one whose DNA had been revealed as the true father, was still a mystery, and that uncertainty ate away at her every day. How could she explain this to her children? How could she tell them that the man they had once known as a potential father figure wasn't theirs after all? Each time she saw Evan in the courtroom, his polished exterior began to crack more and more. In the beginning, he had been distant, cold, and impenetrable figure. But now, as the trial wore on, there were moments when Amelia caught glimpses of the man behind the suit. The way his shoulders slumped as he left the stand, the way he clenched his jaw after particularly biting questions, the flashes of uncertainty in his eyes. There was no denying it. The man she had once seen as powerful, invincible, was now just as vulnerable as she was. He wasn't the cold, aloof figure that had once seemed so untouchable. He was human, flawed, and in that realization, Amelia found a strange sense of clarity. She no longer hated him. In fact, she almost felt sorry for him. His world, his carefully constructed, picture-perfect world, was crumbling, and it was all because of the choices he had made. Yet, even with this new understanding, Amelia knew that nothing would change. The damage had been done, and they couldn't undo the past. But it wasn't just Evan she had to contend with anymore. It was the constant media circus that followed them, turning every moment of the trial into a spectacle. The cameras, the reporters, the opinions of strangers. They were all a constant presence, casting shadows over her every move. Amelia had always been a private person, a mother who did everything she could to shield her children from the harshness of the world. But now, with every camera flash and every headline that read tech CEO's secret love child, she felt exposed. There was nowhere to hide. She had become a symbol, a pawn in a much larger game, and the realization that she had no control over how the world saw her was suffocating. The toll was most evident in her interactions with her children. The twins, Lily and Max, had always been the center of her world, the reason she fought so hard every day. But lately, their questions had started to cut deep. Why don't we have a daddy like everyone else? They asked one evening, their innocent eyes full of curiosity. It broke her heart to see them struggle with something she hadn't fully understood herself until now. She had always tried to protect them from the harsh realities of their situation, but now there was no avoiding it. The world knew about their father, or rather, the lack of one, and that knowledge had shifted everything. On top of everything else, Amelia had started to feel the pressure of time weighing on her. The trial wasn't just about finding out who the father was. It was about the uncertainty of what would come next. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the more the truth was revealed, the more her life, and her children's, was slipping out of her control. Would Evan continue to fight the paternity claim, or would he walk away completely? What would happen if the real father finally stepped forward? How would she balance the pieces of her family, knowing that the foundation had been cracked? And yet, amidst the exhaustion, the emotional turmoil, and the never-ending barrage of legal battles, Amelia found herself growing stronger. She had always prided herself on being resilient, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about standing up for what she believed in, standing up for her children, for her family, no matter what. The trial had tested her in ways she never expected, but it had also shown her the depth of her own strength. The old Amelia, the one who had been uncertain and unsure, was beginning to fade. The woman standing in that courtroom, facing down the man who had once been a part of her life, was someone new. Someone who wasn't afraid to fight for the truth, no matter how messy or painful it might be. She had thought that once the trial was over, everything would fall into place. But now, Amelia realized that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She was no longer just fighting for the truth about her children's father. She was fighting for her own future, her own sense of identity, and the life she wanted to build for herself and her children. The emotional fallout of the trial was far from over, but Amelia knew that, for the first time, she was in control of her own story. She had made it through the hardest part, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, she wasn't going to let it define her. She had her children, and that was all that mattered. They were the future, and no matter what happened in the trial, Amelia would fight for them with everything she had left. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the courtroom buzzed with a nervous energy as the trial entered its final stages. Amelia could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she sat in the hard wooden chair, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions: anger, fear, frustration, and for a brief moment, a flicker of hope. But as the trial reached its climax, something unexpected happened. Evan's lawyer, who had seemed so confident from the start, was now looking at his notes with a furrowed brow, his usual bravado replaced by a palpable tension. The case was not going the way he had planned. The defense had been meticulous, trying to paint Amelia as desperate for attention, questioning her motives, and deflecting attention away from Evan. But now, with each passing day, the evidence and the unraveling of hidden truths had begun to wear down their defenses. And today, something shifted in the air. The truth was about to be laid bare. Amelia had been bracing for this moment. She had been preparing herself for the final round of questioning, the final push to either prove her case or risk losing everything. But she hadn't anticipated the bombshell that would drop in the middle of the day. As the judge called for another round of statements, Evan's lawyer stood, but this time, something in his stance was different. There was an uncertainty in his voice, a shift from the practiced arrogance he had shown before. He motioned to the evidence they had presented earlier, the DNA results, the testimonies, and even Evan's ambiguous recollections of the night he and Amelia had shared. Everything seemed to be carefully designed to protect Evan. But then, with a flicker of hesitation, the lawyer made an unexpected admission. "Your Honor," he began, his voice tight, "we have received additional information that could potentially change the course of this trial. We have uncovered evidence that suggests another individual may have been involved in the circumstances surrounding Ms. Harris's children. This is a development we did not foresee, and we ask for a moment to address it." The words hung in the air like a slap. Amelia's heart skipped a beat as she turned to David, her lawyer, who looked just as stunned as she felt. Her mind raced. Another individual? What was he talking about? Could this be the moment where everything she had worked for would either come crashing down or fall into place? The judge's voice broke through her swirling thoughts. "Please clarify, Mr. Phillips. Are you suggesting there is another potential father involved?" The courtroom fell silent as the defense lawyer nodded, then gestured toward a stack of papers that had suddenly appeared on the table. Amelia felt a cold chill sweep over her. She had spent so many sleepless nights grappling with her suspicions, but this was something completely new. She had never expected to hear those words spoken in such a public setting, and yet they seemed to echo in her ears, louder than any of the prior accusations. David leaned over to her, his voice low. This is unexpected. We'll need to figure out how to handle this quickly. Amelia, there's more at play here than we knew. Her mind was still reeling, but she tried to keep her composure. She had come this far. She had to stay strong, even when everything seemed to be unraveling before her. David stood up, his eyes flicking to the judge, then to the defense. He was ready to respond, but Amelia could sense the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Evan anymore. This was bigger. There were more hidden layers, more secrets, more truths that needed to be uncovered. The defense lawyer continued, reading from the newly presented evidence. It has come to our attention that a second man, whose identity is known to Ms. Harris, has had significant involvement during the period in which the children were conceived. We believe this new information might require further investigation into the circumstances. Amelia's chest tightened. There it was, another layer of the past she wasn't ready to face. Another man. A part of her wanted to scream, to run from the courtroom, to tell them all that she had had enough. She had come here looking for answers about Evan, and now it seemed like the truth was slipping further and further away from her grasp. But another part of her, the part that had fought so hard for her children, the part that was relentless in her search for answers, knew that she couldn't back down now. She had to find the real truth, whatever it was. The judge turned to both sides, giving them a moment to adjust to the new information. Amelia could see the smirk on Evan's face as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The revelation seemed to catch him off guard, but it didn't seem to shake him as much as it should have. Was he hiding something? Did he know more than he had let on? The questions swirled in her mind, but she pushed them aside. Now wasn't the time for doubt. David was already moving, addressing the court, demanding the right to investigate this new lead. He made it clear that they would not allow anyone to hide behind more secrets, that they needed to know everything if they were going to find the truth. Amelia could see him working his way through the legal intricacies, pushing for transparency. But beneath the professional language and courtroom procedures, Amelia could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The stakes had just gotten much higher. The new evidence, the new twist in the case, had shifted the focus once again. The trial was no longer just about who the father was. It was about something deeper. It was about trust, betrayal, and the people who had shaped her life, even if they weren't the ones she thought they were. As the room simmered with anticipation, Amelia realized that she had to let go of the old story she had told herself. This wasn't just about proving Evan's paternity anymore. It was about understanding her own past, confronting all the people who had played a role in her journey, and finding a way to move forward. For the first time since the trial began, Amelia felt a strange sense of power. She had fought hard to bring the truth to light, and now that truth was beginning to reveal itself in ways she hadn't expected. The world she had known, so carefully controlled, so carefully compartmentalized, was crumbling. But in the wreckage, she could see the possibility of something new, something real. There was more to uncover, but this was her moment. No matter what happened next, she had found the strength to face it. And for the first time, she was ready to face the unknown. The final day of the trial arrived with a heavy sense of inevitability. The courtroom, once filled with the energy of legal battles and personal revelations, now felt like a cold, silent space. Amelia sat at her table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes flicking from her lawyer to Evan, who sat across from her, his once imposing demeanor now stripped of its previous confidence. It had been a long, exhausting journey, one that had taken more from her than she had ever anticipated. But here they were at the end of it all. For weeks, she had relived the painful moments that led her here. The nights she and Evan had shared, the uncertain years that followed, the shocking DNA tests that had revealed the truth, and the countless hours spent in the courtroom, battling not only for the identity of her children's father, but for her own place in this tangled mess. But now, as the trial reached its final moments, Amelia found herself staring at the blank canvas of what would come next. Her thoughts drifted to the twins, Lily and Max had grown up under the shadow of unanswered questions, and though they were still so young, they had absorbed more than Amelia had wanted them to. The questions, the looks from other children, the whispers when people realized their father wasn't present. Amelia had tried to shield them from the worst of it, but now the truth would be out there for everyone to see. The idea of telling them that the man they had once believed to be their father wasn't, and that someone else, someone they had never known, was truly responsible for their existence, weighed heavily on her heart. How would they react? How would she tell them? But as much as her heart ached for the children, there was something else, something more profound that had settled deep within her: relief. This trial, for all its pain and turmoil, had forced her to confront the truth, not just about Evan and the identity of her children's father, but about herself. She had fought through fear, self-doubt, and betrayal. She had stood in the face of overwhelming odds and had come out on the other side stronger than she had ever imagined. Amelia wasn't just fighting for her children anymore. She was fighting for herself, for the woman she had become in the process. Evan's lawyer stood to make the final argument, trying one last time to frame the case in Evan's favor. They had pushed for a quick settlement, hoping to avoid the embarrassment of a public resolution. They argued that the whole situation had been a misunderstanding, that Amelia's claims were driven by emotion, and that Evan should not be held responsible for something that had been a single, fleeting encounter years ago. The lawyer's voice was smooth, practiced, and convincing. He spoke of Evan's dedication to his business, his commitment to his family, and how this trial had been nothing more than a distraction. Evan sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed forward, but Amelia could see the strain in his features. He wasn't as composed as he had been at the beginning of the trial. She could see the cracks in his armor now, the tension in his jaw, the subtle tremor in his hand as it rested on the table. For all his wealth and power, Evan was just as vulnerable as anyone else. He had thought he could control everything, including his own past. But the truth had slipped through the cracks, and now it was inescapable. When it was her turn to speak, Amelia rose slowly. Her legs felt like jelly beneath her, but her resolve was firm. She had done everything she could to keep the focus on her children's future, and now she had to close the chapter on this dark, painful period of her life. She looked at the judge, and then, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to meet Evan's gaze. She didn't hate him. She didn't even know if she could still blame him for what had happened. The years of silence, the missed opportunities, it had all been a series of choices that had led them here. But now, standing before him, she realized she didn't need him to be the father of her children anymore. She had done it on her own. She had raised them, loved them, and provided for them without his help. It was time to let go of the past and move forward. She took a deep breath and began speaking, her voice steady, though there was a quiet emotion beneath the surface. I came to this trial with one simple goal: to find the truth for my children. They deserve to know who they are, who their father is. But more than that, they deserve a future where they aren't held back by the secrets of the past. I'm not here to destroy anyone or to punish anyone. I'm here because I owe it to my kids to give them the answers they deserve. And I owe it to myself to stop living in a shadow, to stop pretending that things can stay the same when everything has changed. She paused, her eyes drifting down to the table for a moment, gathering her thoughts. This trial has shown me so many things about myself, things I didn't want to see. It's shown me the strength I never knew I had. And it's shown me that I can't keep waiting for someone to save me. I have to save myself. I've done that for my children, and I'll continue to do it, no matter what happens here today. The room was silent for a long moment. Evan's gaze didn't leave her, but his expression was unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. But Amelia didn't need to see his reaction. She knew she had already won the most important battle. She had found the truth, she had stood her ground, and she had come out on the other side, unbroken. The judge finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. The court will deliberate and issue a final ruling in the coming days. However, it's clear that both sides have presented compelling arguments. The truth of this case is complex, but it is undeniable that the lives of the children involved have been greatly impacted. As the judge's words lingered in the air, Amelia felt a sense of finality settle over her. The trial was over, the truth was out, and now it was time to let go of the past. She had no idea what the future would look like, but for the first time, she was ready to face it, whatever it might bring. The decision wasn't in her hands anymore, but it didn't matter. The real victory had already been won, and as she left the courtroom, walking out into the bright sunlight, Amelia knew one thing for certain. She had the strength to rebuild, to start anew. And no matter what happened next, she was ready to face it with her head held high. As Amelia stood outside the courthouse, the finality of the trial settled in her chest like a weight she hadn't realized she had been carrying all these years. The hum of the city around her seemed distant, muffled by the swirling thoughts in her head. It had been an exhausting journey, physically, emotionally, and mentally. And now, with the trial behind her, there was a strange sense of emptiness mixed with relief. The long road that had started with her suspicions about Evan had come to a close, and now she would have to navigate the aftermath. She had spent so long wondering, questioning, feeling lost in a fog of uncertainty. But now, the truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. She knew who her children's father was. The man who had once seemed so distant, so untouchable, was no longer a figure in the distance. The courtroom battle had exposed it all: the secrets, the lies, and the painful truths. And although Evan's role in her life had shifted, her life, her children's lives, were now unburdened by the mystery. Amelia had expected the truth to bring closure, but the reality was more complicated. The court had ruled that Evan was not the father of her children, and the identity of the biological father had been confirmed through DNA testing. Yet, as much as she had fought for this outcome, it didn't feel like the end of the story. There were still so many unanswered questions. How would this revelation change the way her children saw their family? Would the biological father step into their lives, or would he remain a shadow in their past? But even amidst the uncertainty, Amelia felt something else: freedom. The freedom to stop looking backward, to stop clinging to the past. The truth, no matter how complicated, had given her the clarity she needed. She had fought for the answers, but now it was time to focus on moving forward, to build a future that was no longer dictated by the mistakes of the past. The following days were filled with a mix of emotions. The court decision had made headlines, and as expected, the media was relentless in its coverage of the trial and the scandal surrounding Evan's secret. But for Amelia, the outside noise seemed more distant now. She had grown used to the public scrutiny, used to people whispering about her family, judging her decisions. But as the noise from the media faded, she realized something important. She didn't need validation from anyone else. Her children had been her focus, her reason for everything, and that would never change. At home, the twins were still processing the news. Lily, her older daughter, had been the first to ask about the trial, her curious, innocent eyes filled with questions. Amelia had been open with them, explaining as best as she could what had happened and how things had changed. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure when or how they would fully understand, but she knew they needed to hear it from her. "I don't know what it all means yet, sweetheart," Amelia had said softly, sitting down beside Lily on the couch. "But what I do know is that I love you, and nothing will ever change that. You and Max are the most important people in my life. That's the only truth that matters." It had been a hard conversation, but a necessary one. And as the days passed, Amelia noticed a shift in her children. It wasn't immediate. There were moments of confusion, of sadness, and sometimes even anger. But slowly, they began to find their way through the storm of emotions that had surrounded them. They began to understand that family wasn't about who they shared blood with. It was about love, and in that, they were richer than most. Evan, too, had begun to fade from their lives. The finality of the trial meant that they no longer had to live in the shadows of uncertainty. As much as Amelia had once hoped for a relationship between Evan and her children, she realized now that it had never been about him. It had always been about her ability to love and care for her children on her own terms. Evan had chosen not to be involved, and in his absence, Amelia had stepped into the role of both mother and father. She had built a life for her children, and though it hadn't always been easy, She had done it with strength, resilience, and determination. A few weeks after the trial, Amelia received an unexpected letter. It was from the biological father, the man whose identity had been revealed during the trial. The letter was simple, but it carried with it an undeniable weight. He apologized for not being there for the years of absence, and he expressed a desire to meet her and the children. But as Amelia read through the words, she found herself hesitating. She had spent so much time focusing on Evan, on finding answers, that now she wasn't sure what to do with this new piece of the puzzle. The man had been a part of her past, but he wasn't part of her life now. The choice was hers, and for the first time, she felt no pressure to make a decision that didn't feel right for her family. She didn't respond to the letter immediately. Instead, she spent a few quiet days reflecting on everything that had happened. The legal battles, the revelations, the heartache, all of it had brought her here. And in that moment, Amelia realized that it was okay to let go. The truth was no longer a burden. It was simply a part of her journey, and the path ahead was hers to choose. The following months passed with a quiet sense of peace settling into her life. Amelia continued to raise her children with the same unwavering love and dedication she always had. She found new strength in herself, in her ability to navigate the complexities of life without depending on anyone else to validate her worth. She had fought for her children, for her own truth, and now they were free to move forward. And though the past would always be a part of her story, Amelia knew she had finally found the peace she had been seeking. The future, once uncertain, now felt open with possibility. She didn't need to look back anymore. She was ready to embrace what came next, with her head held high and her heart full of hope. Her children had the answers they needed, and with that knowledge, they could build their own lives without the weight of unanswered questions. And for Amelia, that was enough. She had given them the foundation they needed, one built on love, truth, and the courage to face whatever the future held. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.